Thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks for participating in the webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the successful transition from CCPA to CPRA. I'll do a quick introduction of myself and the rest of the panel here in just a minute. One thing is, as we kind of get going into the presentation and the webinar, we'd really encourage you guys to participate, ask as many questions as you can. We'd like to keep this as conversational as we can, instead of us kind of a death by PowerPoint, if you will. So as we go into a quick introduction to myself and the rest of the panel, I'll let them introduce. I know a handful of you were probably expecting Sebastian from GPC to be part of the panel today. Unfortunately, he has some unforeseen circumstances and was unable to make the webinar. So we're sending our condolences to him as he goes through some personal things on his side, and we're hoping that we can include him on a webinar here in the near future. As far as the rest of the introductions, my name is Jeff Wheeler. I'm the Vice President of Product here at Didomi. I've been in this space for a little under a decade, building out multiple CMPs and privacy products. So really happy to be here. And let me turn it over to Julia and Tomas.
Thanks, Jeff. I think we're going to get into your platform in a bit, but I'm Julia Schulman. I am a co-founder of Core, which is an ads privacy learning platform. And thanks so much to Jeff and Thomas/Tama for asking me to join. Fun fact, Tama and I actually used to work together. He was my outside French counsel, and then I brought him in-house. We worked together at AppNexus, which is now Xandr.
Yes, I had the to work with Julia for many years, which got me to the point of being invited on this panel to talk about CPRA. Thank you, Julia. So I am Didomi's Chief Privacy Officer, and so I'm going to try to be a good replacement for Sebastian tonight and try to bring my European vibe to the webinar.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So just a quick introduction for you guys that don't know about Didomi. We're a French-based privacy platform, originally founded just pre-GDPR, helping build out consent and preference management solutions throughout Europe and now expanding into North America. So, we have our privacy suite that's represented in about 27 countries and available in multiple languages worldwide. We have offices in Paris, Madrid, New York, and Berlin. And you can see some of the companies that we work with. So that's a really high level of Didomi. Julie, do you want to introduce us to Core?
Sure. So I've been, like Jeff, in the privacy ad space for about a decade. I've held a number of roles across legal, product, privacy, public policy, and have now gone out and run a platform called Core. And Core is fundamentally an ads privacy learning platform. So it helps clients follow key developments and analysis in the space. There's a lot of good legal analysis out there, but it's really hard to tie that analysis out to product developments, tech developments, and commercial launches. And so we help our clients follow those. We do advisory and custom engagements, everything from studies, help on go-to-market, coming in and helping people really do deep dives on their data use and planning. We run trainings and workshops, and we really bring unique experience to that table, given that we've worked cross-functionally across legal, public policy, product, and tech.
Great, thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the rest of the webinar. Just a quick overview of what we're hoping to discuss today. We want to talk about the U.S. state privacy laws as a whole. We'll probably dig a little bit into some comparisons and how it may affect some of the global privacy laws, but we'll have a pretty strong emphasis on the transition from CCPA and CPRA. Obviously talking about things like GPC, the global privacy control, how we prepare for the updates of CCPA to CPRA and the risk of not preparing. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on any details specifically about things like COPA or HIPAA or anything like that, or GDPR or LGPD, but we'll definitely share some of our insights in terms of best learnings maybe that we've learned from our experience with GDPR. So as we hop into it, I think it's important for us to kind of cover the transition and the update of CPA with CPRA. So, you can see here on the screen, CCPA went into effect January of 2020, and enforcement began in July of 2020. The final CPRA regulations then, once CPRA was passed in California, began last July, which I'm sure many people here are aware of. And then those final amendments by CPRA went into effect January 1st. It was a little bit unique, being that the final CPRA regulations weren't approved until the amendment went into effect. And then obviously in July of this year, CPRA goes into effect with Virginia, Colorado, and Connecticut. And Virginia is already in enforcement as of January 1st. A couple things, what is CCPA and being amended by CPRA, and I think we'll get into some of the conversation here, is it's a new California law, or it's an update to the California law that applies to all California residents regardless of physical location. Again, as mentioned, it's enforced as of July 1st, and it obligates a notice of data collection at or before collection occurs. It also has some requirements around PIAs, privacy impact assessments, dark patterns, data minimalization, cross-contextual behavior ads, mandatory opt-outs, and signal recognition. So maybe here, Julia and Tomas, this is a question that we get a lot internally is, it applies to California residents regardless of physical location. And I think this is something that we heard from our learnings in GDPR is, how do you make sure that you cover as much of that as possible, not always knowing a person's residency, when you identify them on a website with something like an IP address. Do you guys have a best practice you can recommend?
Yeah, I've seen it done different ways, and it really depends on the company and whether they have account-based relationships with their users, or whether they don't have logged in users or really any directly identifiable information about users. So folks that have logged in users kind of sometimes will actually have true account-based information about them, and we'll use that account-based information. Think about a company who really does provide you services in your house and knows where you're located. But there are many other companies that will just go off of geolocation. So to your point, Jeff, they'll do just a quick geo lookup. They'll have their digital property optimized so that, the first thing is that you're really looking to see, is that user located within the confines of California, or, if you're looking at, for example, Virginia, Colorado, et cetera, looking at that. And then based on that signal, they'll apply a different rule set. And then the last thing is, there are some companies that just say, we can't do this at a state level or even at a global level. We're gonna think about what is the highest common denominator of requirements we see globally, and we're just going to apply that to all of our users worldwide. Thomas, I don't know, what you guys are seeing in terms of the functionality that your clients are using in your platform. I know your CMP allows clients to enable different rule sets based on geo or, globally if they want to.
Yes, and as you were talking, actually, I was thinking about so what you described, like most of the geo lookup idea, is what we apply in Europe. When we have an Italian user, for instance, we're not going to display the same banner as we would for a French user. So that would clearly be our, I guess, way to go. But the reality is it's a bit different in the US, and there's a third option or a fourth option that you didn't mention. I guess we could also just ask for the user, where are you from? Which state law do you want to apply? Are you a Utah resident? Are you a California resident? And it may not be true, but why would you, as a user, be lying about something like that? I'm not entirely clear. So I guess there is another option. It's not like there's not like a perfect option. The best option, I think, would be to be practical and to identify what the risk might be. The risk of getting audited by the CPPA. I suspect that could happen, but they would probably not use a VPN to simulate a Utah resident user. I don't know. So there are many ways to achieve this, and I think the best route to compliance on that front and to comply with many state laws or even worldwide regulations is probably to use a tool that's going to provide the flexibility to do all that. All the solutions could be used depending on, to your point, Julia, whether you have a logged-in environment, whether you want to use geolocation-based, means to actually identify where the user is coming from. So I think it really depends on that. Of course, you always need legal guidance anyway. So that would be my takeaway.
Yeah. And just, and look at where your user base is located. If you have a very, very, high user base in California, again, you might want to just use that as the highest bar for the US and kind of apply the same rule set across the US. If you really have a diverse user set and you decide to do it differently, it's really working hand in hand with the business, understanding their goals in terms of user experience. We'll get into kind of how they're using data and sharing data in a few minutes, but understanding that, and then you can kind of set up using a tool of your choice to do that. And Didomi certainly facilitates that.
Yeah, it's also interesting, that use case specifically of geolocating specifically to California resident. But, a lot of the questions we've also seen recently related that to are, what happens if you are, say, IP geolocating and they travel from state to state that have varying privacy laws? That is a question we get obviously from Europe to the US, but, as each state passes a new law, that in a way creates more complexity on how you do kind of start a best practice, if you will, to comply with multiple states that are, bordering each other. Right.
And again, I've seen some clients just say, hey, look, we're going to take the highest common denominator and we're going to apply that once. And then if we maintain state on the user, we'll apply that across states. And if they want to do it state to state, they'll have to sometimes prompt, a new prompt depending on how they're managing things.
Yeah. Great. So I think as we hop to the next slide, I think there's one piece on this slide, right? You guys in the webinar can obviously see some of the changes. Column left is CCPA, CPRA on the right, and some of the updated changes. And I think the opt-out of sharing of cross-context behavioral advertising really changes a lot. We're seeing obviously changes based off like the Sephora ruling, but this call out in particular really kind of changes that requirement where I think a lot of companies said, hey, I don't sell data. But now this idea of sharing data, especially off advertising, changes that. So from you guys' point of view, like when would behavioral advertising require something like consent or notification?
Consent or notification versus an opt-out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're going to get into it in a moment, and I'll prompt Thomas as well. But for example, if a user has enabled global privacy control, at a browser level, and they go to visit a site, and that site is doing cross-context behavioral advertising and has made a business decision that they want to communicate with the user and ask the user to maybe turn off a global privacy control, so to actually opt in to receiving cross-context behavioral ads, or really for that site to share data for cross-context behavioral ads, they'll prompt, a consent banner for something like that. And we'll talk about what that might look like in the US, but that's the major use case. If a company is using sensitive health data, or, there's a child involved, and we're not going to get into the nuances of children's opt-ins, but I do think sensitive data and geolocation data, which is considered sensitive data. Thomas, how are you thinking about it?
No, I thought about the same, but also when I was looking at the regulations, I was wondering whether there's a principle of purpose limitation that's also included in the regulations, and it seems to imply that when I first looked at it, and I'm not talking about the final version of the regs, but when I first looked at it, I questioned myself. Like I wasn't sure actually whether behavioral advertising, because it wasn't compatible necessarily with the first purposes for which the data could be used, um, would require consent, or like the regs were requiring consent. I feel this is not something people are debating in the US, but still, it's still in the. So what's your take? Actually, it's more like a question.
Welcome to mine and Tomas philosophy class. But it's a great point. It's a great question. I mean, I think in the U.S. and Tamana will talk about this a bit later. It's generally been more of an opt-out type model. So generally companies can use data, and then they just provide an opt-out for certain use cases that do require user choice versus Europe, which sort of at least historically has been looked at as maybe more of a consent model, although that's shifting as well. But I don't think anyone is making that argument that cross-context behavioral ads or any specific use case requires consent unless there is a higher burden like use of sensitive data, or the user has already set a device level opt-out signal that you need to kind of prompt them to turn off or opt in around.
Great. Thanks, guys. So, I mean, I think this is a good slide to obviously kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the webinar of what should I be doing. We see an example here on the left of what, maybe a consent banner will look like in terms of CPRA. It's obviously updated with the idea of sharing information and limiting the use of sensitive information. I think number 2 on this point, though, of mapping all data collection of use and sharing is quite the interesting topic to bring up, especially, for us that were at IAPP last week and part of some of those panels. There seemed to be a lot of noise, if you will, about the idea of picking up these beacons and trackers and pixels. We heard a lot about that. I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are in terms of that level of importance that's kind of being escalated right now, not only from like CPPA but also the FTC.
Yeah. So this is not something that, this isn't a quote strict requirement in the regulation, but really what's going on is you can't confidently meet your requirements under, any of these regulations if you don't actually know what data you're collecting, how you're using it, who you're sharing it with, and very importantly, who you're sharing it with from a vendor, partner, and third-party perspective. That includes anyone who's embedded code, to your point, Jeff, on a digital property, or who is managing to kind of inject code through creatives that are run on sites. And what that ends up leading to is a real deep dive that is necessary. And sometimes you need to use scanning tools to actually understand, what's really firing on your page. And that should collect kind of information on most trackers that are getting access to your user data. It's not perfect, but generally speaking, it's really going to help you out there. And what the impetus was for that is a combination of, the Sephora decision under CCPA, which has obviously been amended at this point, and then a number of additional requirements that that are coming through with CPRA, which includes, the need to truly do a privacy risk assessment, the need to truly identify who's service provider and who isn't, the need to put in place contracts, with all parties that are getting access to this data, and the need to manage opt-out signals. I think people kind of stuck their heads in the sand when CCPA went into effect and just said, what we've been doing for opt-outs on the ad space is good enough. That was the DAA opt-out and AI opt-out of interest-based advertising. And they just said, that's enough. And what that did is it didn't catch a number of use cases. So it didn't catch kind of the more traditional data providers or DMPs that were maybe on a page that weren't actually targeting users. It didn't catch certain trackers that were running on advertiser digital properties that maybe were building up profiles on users across sites, or were facilitating certain cross-context use cases that advertisers didn't think about. And it definitely didn't help people put in place the right contracts and controls around the scenes. Shama, kind of what's your perspective? I know you guys have a tool that actually I think was originally built out to help folks in GDPR understand kind of who was firing on their sites, and is now actually very relevant and helpful in the US.
Yeah, I mean, while you were talking, actually, I was thinking that what seems to be happening in the US, and you may please stop me if I'm going nowhere with this. But since you were working on European soil in 2018 when GDPR came into force, you probably remember that the first thing that companies were doing to comply with GDPR was actually to scan their websites and properties, digital properties, to figure out, what was going on there. Like, they had no idea. They did not, some of them were, but like most of them were actually clueless as to who was operating on their site and who was getting access to personal information, who was sharing it with whom. And so in 2018, we saw that. And from where I sit, this is the scanning moment for the US companies, maybe in California at least, or the ones operating in California, which is a bit surprising because CCPA has already been around for a few years now. And so I'm surprised that it's happening now. But having said that, yes, we do have a tool at Didomi which can help scan websites. The way it works is, of course, like very, I would say very sophisticated. And of course, I'm saying this as a Didomi employee, but I'm also saying this because we have many years of GDPR experience. The tool that got developed is actually really able to identify even the pixels on page that are hidden sometimes. And it's going to look at the source code of the page. And I think that's what one company should expect from a scanning tool. It's like that depth of scanning power, I would say. And then we also provide, of course, additional information on the vendors because we have the vendors database. But ultimately, I'm a bit surprised. What I'm trying to say is that I'm a bit surprised that it's only happening now in the US. And I'm guessing that's got to do with the fact that CPRA comes with data. I was going to say a data protection agency, but it's more like an enforcement agency, and the first one in the US when it comes to data protection. And I feel like, and then there's been the comment from the FTC as well. But it feels like there's definitely a scanning moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think part of it is certainly that, right? It's just there's now an agency that's been set up, or not an agency, an arm that's been set up to actually help the AG enforce. Also the FTC comments on the fact that it's not just about cookies, like newsflash, by the way. There's a million other things that can help with tracking on a site, from web beacons, pixels, tags, you name it. So it's despite everyone saying cookies, it's not just that. And then I think the other thing was the lens of some of the enforcement actions that came out, even just under CCPA, which was frankly not as onerous as CPRA, and the Sephora one was one that made people wake up. I could kind of talk about how that decision, frankly, I don't think was actually all that helpful. But for some folks who are on the call to brand, the main takeaways again are you can't, if you need to provide an opt-out, you can't force a user to kind of jump to another page to have to effectuate that opt-out. It needs to happen just directly off your site. You need to understand who's on there. Frankly, there's probably some folks on there, some pixels, trackers, you name it, who are doing something called that would fit within a sale or cross-context behavioral advertising. And if you're using and collecting your first-party data to go target users on another site, you need to talk to your attorney, and it should be someone who truly is familiar with advertising, and talk about whether or not they believe that fits within cross-context behavioral advertising, or whether it would fit within a business purpose. There are actually a number of different arguments that could be made. I've heard every single argument under the sun, although I'm always open to some new arguments. And there are folks who are taking more conservative routes as brands and just saying, we're going to provide an opt-out, or we're going to ask everyone to opt in. And there are others who are saying, our first-party data is our first-party data, and we truly believe we can deploy that where we need to, and it fits within a business purpose, whether it's for targeting, measurement, or otherwise. But that's exactly what you need to be focused on, and that is what the Sephora case was focused on. And unfortunately, in their enforcement action, the AG didn't get into that detail around which use cases constitute a sale. Cross-context behavioral advertising didn't exist. And so I think, unfortunately, the main takeaways were just put contracts in place. You're probably doing some form of sale, but good luck figuring out what it is. and make sure you're facilitating an opt-out directly off your page as opposed to forcing users to go to another site.
Yeah, I think one thing that's also interesting about what you guys have brought up during that, right, is obviously cookies are not the only thing. We're seeing that in the browsers with Google, eventually deprecating the third-party cookie, which obviously negates some of this, not all of it, with the first-party data. But it's also interesting that they're bringing this up now, because I think things like piggybacking will start to become something that's now more relevant. And I wonder if that's also part of why this is happening. The conversations I know I personally had in the past of, sitting down with the customer and showing them a scan of their page, and they're like, oh, where did that Pinterest tag come from? So this idea, I think, of tag governance is really, being propelled quickly into California and most likely the rest of the U.S.
Yeah. People just thought they were only responsible for the vendors they had directly signed up for, and that's unfortunately not the case.
Yep.
And again, I actually think it's very similar to what happened in Europe. The fact that regulators are actually encouraging companies to go figure out what's happening on your website properties. You should know now, and you're in control. I think the message is you're in control. So we're almost referring to the concept of controller, being in control of what's happening on a specific website. That's your business. You should know better. And that's the first step. That the data protection authorities in Europe had the same strategy at the beginning. So we can expect the next steps. We should look back at what happened in Europe to see where the FTC and eventually the CPPA are going to go.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, what should I prepare for? I think we somewhat covered this, right? We talked a little bit about the comprehensive notice of collection, the right to opt out and share and manage your user requests, a little bit of the tag governance, if you will. My slides are going crazy. I apologize. But what are if we want to highlight some of the maybe the non-compliance or slow planning carrier risks, I think those are really important for us to discuss a little bit here. I think if I relate this back to May of 2018, pre-GDPR, and we get this plethora of requests of how do I put a consent notice up on my page, or how do I do this? How would you relate a lot of those same learnings to the slow planning maybe that we're seeing now in the industry?
Yeah. So I given our business and sort of our focus on bringing different cross-functional teams together across legal and tech, and I see that there are a good number of tech folks on the call, not just legal folks. This is not just about fear of audits and fines. 100%, there's a risk out there that someone's going to come knock on your door, or that you're a vendor, who is a client who potentially pulls you into some kind of investigation. But I always emphasize the real costly and major challenging situations are when you don't understand what your options are, and you don't understand the impact of what you're doing on the business and plan for that. And a great example is thinking about these opt-out regimes. Technically, what's that going to require? From a marketing perspective, or from your actual business and services leading to your revenue, what's the impact going to be? Have you modeled that out? Have you thought about it? This is not just a legal exercise. It's going to influence, if you're a digital property, the potential revenue that you can bring in from an ad business. If you're a brand, what users you can reach across the web, what your interplay is with them. And then, if you're a player within the ad ecosystem, which is everyone, how you're going to interoperate with everyone. And it can be real messy and real time consuming. And it can have a real impact, not just on your compliance, but actually on your ability to run your business, have a good consumer experience, and drive revenue. And Tama, I know, I'm preaching to someone who has worked with me for a long time. And so you've heard this a lot, but I think it's really important for this group to understand that, and for tech, product, and legal and policy folks to really work together, understand the risk, understand the solutions, and don't just assume that there's only one solution.
A question for you, actually, Julia. When you're referring to the risk, this risk specifically, are you referring to the monetization risk, for instance?
Yeah, I'm referring to certainly the monetization risk, I think is the biggest risk for digital properties if you're running an ad business and you don't understand kind of the impact that this is going to have either on your ability to, monetize users that are coming to your site or allow for reporting that, advertisers are expecting to get, allow for your ability to kind of use your user data across different platforms. But it is a big risk to big brands that have multi-million, if not billion-dollar budgets, who just think that they can keep doing exactly what they've been doing and keep measuring against the same KPIs. Maybe you can, maybe you've got the legal arguments to do that. I would be shocked if that's going to be the case. Like the reason the regulators put this in place is they do want to see changes in behavior and changes in practice. But those are the biggest risks that I would flag. And then as a vendor, if you're behind the scenes, you need to understand how you plug into this ecosystem and what the impact will be on your ability to use data, for the use cases that you use them for today.
So it looks like we actually have a couple questions from a slide or two ago. So why don't we take a chance to answer these real quick? These are both from Yasmin. So if the data collection happens on the same page there is a privacy notice or in the footer, is that sufficient as a notice at or before collection, or do we need to add the notice right at the place of collection as well?
So Jeff, Tama, and I were debating this the other day. The unfortunate answer is there's no perfect answer right now. Interestingly, U.S. regulators, California regulators have explicitly said that they understand kind of cookie banner fatigue in Europe, and they're not necessarily looking to replicate that. But I think they're looking for something kind of in between, something that really is something that a user would see, and kind of a link that is buried in a privacy policy, deep down on a digital property that no one's ever going to see. So Jeff, I know you've kind of been in discussions at industry tables with other privacy tech and talking about that and kind of what it's going to look like over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I always relate it back to, every time I fly and land in Paris to visit our offices, and I get off the plane and everything on my phone just starts blowing up from that cookie fatigue. And so, I think there's a lot of potential there. I think there's also ways of, starting to look at things like consent slightly differently, not just throwing up, a banner or a pop-in place saying, hey, say yes or no. I think as an industry, not just Didomi, but the way we look at it, you can look at things like, are there better ways to ask for consent? I've used this analogy before. Like, do you ever go to a website and as soon as you hit the page, they ask you to sign up for a newsletter? It never happens, right? But there's always like some time for you to browse the site, to interact with the site. And I think you can kind of take consent, for instance, like a cookie banner along those same lines of maybe delaying consent, which would delay some of the things from happening right away, or progressively asking for consent when it's applicable to create that better user experience to avoid that cookie fatigue. But I think that's kind of the direction that we need to start thinking of. And also, maybe it's not a banner. Are there different ways of asking for consent? Can it be done through a chatbot? Can it be done through an icon or something in the corner, like you see on maybe some of the accessibility tools? So I think there's a lot of possibility there, of us as an industry now with the U.S. trying to avoid cookie fatigue to start to adapt a little bit.
Right. But I think, Yasmin, like to your direct answer, there are plenty of digital properties, right, that are kind of sticking with their standard, notifications. I'm not convinced that that's going to kind of hold over time, but if it's something you need to do in the short term, you kind of have to think about your risk profile. But from a user experience perspective, I'm fairly confident that's going to shift over time.
So Tomas, maybe for Jasmine or Yasmin's other question, maybe I can ask this one to you. What is a sufficient notice of collection? Would something like click here for how we use your personal information suffice?
So click here for how we use your personal information is probably not enough. That would, in my opinion, take you to, as a user, take you to the privacy policy, because that's where you're going to describe your data processing and how you process data in general. I think the way we envision things at this point is a place where you're going to be able to control what's happening with your data. And so where, as a user, you're going to be able to get access to some information regarding the data processing, not everything. Like the details will be in the privacy policy, but like a very high level, or like whatever is required in the CPRA and the CCPA will be displayed in the pop-up that will show up when you click on that link in the footer, or like that logo on the top right corner, or like and then you would probably get access to, if the website is actually processing sensitive information, you can also limit the use of that specific kind of personal information. So you should be able to access that right away. Knowing that I think location data, geolocation data is actually sensitive information, which means pretty much many websites, at least all the apps, are probably going to be impacted by this. So I think it should, in my view, the way it should work, it should really be as easy as possible for the user to get access to that information, get access to all the controls that exist. So if there is if data is being sold on that website or shared, then a button should appear to let the user make an informed decision as to whether they want to opt out of that sharing and selling activity. And then same thing for the use of sensitive information. I think users should be able to make a granular choice as to whether they are happy and fine with that data being processed on them. I think that's how I envision things. So it wouldn't necessarily be just click here to get more information on our data practices. I think it should be a bit further than that.
Great, thanks, Paul. All right. So as we get into the next section, you'll probably see a poll pop up, on the chat. So feel free to answer that. But how does CPRA impact me? Obviously, as a business, there's more time and cost, lost revenue and opportunity, increased regulatory exposure, increased litigation risk. And then as a consumer, they're obviously going to be exposed to more choices and options about their data. And so I think this actually bodes fairly well for how far along you guys as the attendees of the webinar are into your privacy journey. But from this impact, is there anything else that maybe you guys see, Julia, tomorrow, that we're maybe missing that we need to take into consideration on the impact?
I would just say two things. It's kind of two sides of the coin. Don't underestimate the work that needs to be done. I think the key is, again, if you're a legal professional, for example, you can only do so much. You're going to have to partner with different folks within the business, whether that's marketing, tech, folks that control your website, you name it, and your vendors for sure. But I think that the flip side of that is, like, don't get too bogged down in some of the serious weeds. Obviously, if you're at a really big platform with a big target on your back, those companies have probably been working for a long time, and I'm not sure if any of them are on this webinar. But for smaller companies, just really prioritize from a risk-based perspective what you need to get done, because it's a journey and you're constantly going to have to be iterating and evolving. And I think we're going to start seeing some additional enforcement actions, unfortunately, but also, additional guidance and recommendations that are going to come out of the various regulators that will continue to help you build out your programs. And of course, we're seeing that, you're seeing that in Europe right now. So you're going to see the same thing in the US.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it's a journey. There's going to be like building a privacy compliance program takes years, and then you need to maintain it. And so there are probably many aspects that are, so to Julia's point, I think prioritizing things and getting making sure that what's really creating an immediate exposure should be the priority. And by that, again, like, I think to know what should be a priority, I think you should just pay attention to what the FTC or other regulators are saying. that's what they're going to be looking for. And so that should be the biggest priority at the moment.
Right. And, we're not kind of giving everyone a permanent like legal checklist here, but Kamal's already harped on a lot of these. So sensitive data use, if you don't have an appropriate privacy notice, if you're selling data, if you don't have a link for people to actually opt out of that, if you don't have a link for people to opt out of cross-context behavior ads, if you're facilitating that, and if someone were to come knock on your door and ask you if you have appropriate contracts in place or an impact assessment, do your impact assessment. And then on the contract side, start the ball rolling on that. It certainly takes time to negotiate. So, in my experience, if you can kind of show that you're really trying, and maybe you're kind of hung up on some points with certain companies, or you've prioritized kind of the biggest risk of clients and partners, that tends to go a long way, typically when a regulator knocks on your door.
Those are all good points, and I think it kind of aligns with what we actually saw in the poll results. Is no one said they're at least 0% along their privacy journey. So we got more than half that are at least 50% and above. So hopefully we're starting to see that transition, and I think that actually leads well into this, right? I mean, why it's important, because we look at like what's happening in the U.S. right now. We've got 5 states that'll be in effect by the end of the year, a 6th by 2025, and then another 10 to 15 that are at some point of legislation that could really change a lot. I think a couple of that are always interesting to watch are Texas, New York, Florida, Washington, to see what that really changes. And I think as we get into this next section, we'll talk a little bit about global privacy control. I know this is a topic that Sebastian was going to cover for us, so we'll do our best to fulfill his expertise. But I also think it's an area that's really kind of unknown or maybe questioned a lot in terms of what it's used for, how it's used, what the future of it's going to look like. And so for those on the call that are not aware what global privacy control, it's a signal that can be embedded on a website through the browsers or through extensions that allows an automated opt-out to occur. It's being supported by a handful of browsers like Brave, DuckDuckGo, as well as some extensions, on the Chrome store to build it in. From the Didomi side of things, and how we've decided to comply with GPC is we let the user know when a GPC is signaled. So you'll see, what one of our banners or notices will look like when GPC is enabled, letting them know, and then also give the user the choice to maybe opt back in if they felt like they still wanted to have access to maybe a social media plugin or marketing to move forward. This obviously, I think, will be changing quite a bit over the years, as we see that Connecticut and Colorado are talking about some type of automated opt-out. And I think when we're having some discussions with Sebastian, even expanding GPC maybe into Europe at some point to support some of the other regulations. But I think, as a preference signal that can be enabled in the browsers, I think there's a few things that are like popped up into my mind. And this first one was actually one of mine that we talked a little bit about yesterday when we were prepping the call that I think is worth bringing up is like, how is GPC not a new do not track signal? I think something for us in the industry that's been around for a long time or familiar with. But, Julia, Tamal, like what's your thoughts here?
I mean, it is basically DNT. So just a little quick history journey for folks on this call. And sorry if you've heard this before. But again, there's been a number of different ways for users to manage their choice around certain types of tracking and use of their data for behavioral ads. There were industry solutions like NAI and DAI, which really just enabled a user to opt out of a sliver of interest-based ads, which was third parties building up profiles in a user, but it didn't apply to first parties. And then there was this browser-based extension, DNT, that was kind of the brainchild of an FTC hearing back in, I think, 07, 08. And so there's a working group that spun out back in 08 of a bunch of researchers, including some very famous like security folks these days, Kapinski, I think, Kaspersky. And, they built up, it's just a very simple, like you can browsers can support it and a user can turn it on, or the browser could turn it on by default. And it signals in the header that user has opted out of tracking, whatever that means. But unfortunately, DNT kind of fell apart between 2011 and I think it officially kind of in 2016, people just said it wasn't going to become, a wide standard because of different commercial and strategic interests of folks at the table. So there were disagreements between, for example, browsers, first parties and third parties, and how they were supposed to respond to that signal. But I was a little surprised that they spun up an entirely new kind of working group and an entirely new initiative and renamed it Global Privacy Control instead of kind of just dusting off the DNT standard that people had spent a lot of time on, and that still exists and some people use today.
Do you think, do you think with CPRA requiring GPC and now CPPA actually having more of like an enforcement type agency instead of the other states essentially requiring on the AGs to enforce, do you think that gives it any more like teeth or hope of going beyond what happened with DNT?
Yeah, certainly. I think they certainly so there's been, I think there was a tweet, so we're making law via Twitter. But the AG actually kind of tweeted out that people are required to be listening to and adhering to these signals. This was way back before CPRA went into effect, and then of course CPRA itself does require people to honor certain signals. It doesn't literally name global privacy control, but I think as long as there is enough backing for it, and it does have some of the backing of some of the biggest publishers in the U.S., including Washington Post, New York Times, you name it, that it's certainly going to become a widely adopted standard, and it's unlikely to fall apart. I think we can talk about in a second kind of some of the shortcomings we see of sort of any signal, but I don't see it really falling away.
No, I think that's a great lead-in to what those challenges are, that we're already seeing with it. I can tell you, like, with technical product side of, point of view, is until all the browsers also kind of respond and accept it, it's very low market share compared to, to other use cases. But I think there's also some unknown about, giving the users the ability to opt back in. But we obviously built it into our platform. I don't think that's always clear. And so, with that not being clear, the challenge of not having a big market share really kind of goes down that road of like the enforcement challenges, and how they're really going to try to do that when they don't have a big enough share of the browsers to recognize it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the challenge of browsers needing to recognize it. Although to your point, I think Chrome is supporting it today, or there's a plugin, so they do have pretty big market share in the U.S. And I would assume Mozilla will probably follow suit, and then the more privacy first, I say that in quotes, browsers, are supporting it as well. But there's also the challenge to your point of, how do you kind of like manage your records around it? Because if you prompt, to your point, like if you prompt a user to opt in, it's not going to change kind of how their settings in their browser unless you sort of build some kind of integration to manage that. And so there's sort of this mismatch of, there's a signal that says this user opted out, but actually I prompted and the user did click something. So how do you kind of prove that out? And manage that? Technically, it's kind of a mess. And then I always say the biggest challenge is, and this is similar to like all signals out there today, whether it's the IAB signal, these browser-based signals, or otherwise, is it's just a signal. And so it's passed, or you're facilitating an API where people can grab that signal and use it, but it doesn't actually change a company's behavior in the face of that opt-out. The company has to adhere to a policy or a contract and actually do what they're saying they're doing. And there's, we're really lacking accountability and audit standards in the industry right now. And so it's like, what is this really solving in the end? So we'll certainly see, where things go. But I think, the bigger changes are going to come around the changes that the gatekeepers, the browsers and operating systems are making, and then kind of the deployment of some of the new privacy enhancing technologies and other solutions in the space over time, which of course you're still going to need to facilitate through, a vendor on your digital property. It'll just look a little bit different. It's really interesting, right? Because this debate exists in Europe too, in the potential like e-privacy regulation. With some of the big publishers not wanting the operating systems and browsers to control their communications with users, and then same conversations around signal management, whether it's IAB TCF or other signals, and whether that really does anything, or whether there needs to be kind of better controls or limitations on vendors and accountability standards.
I think in Europe, I mean, the view of like most publishers in Europe and even advertisers are not seeing this from a nice angle. What's happening with GPC in the US, because it's giving browsers or even browsers extensions too much power. And that the same discussions happened in Europe with respect to DNT as well. It was the same discussion. This is something that's also mentioned in a new regulation that's currently being discussed at the European Parliament or the European Commission. So it's something that keeps popping up, but it feels like the US is in advance on that, and that's due to the opt-out regime, I think. What I find really interesting, though, is I mean, to our point earlier, like, why did we need like a new, like, why didn't we reuse the do not track, which actually makes more sense, like global privacy control. As a user, I'm not even sure I know what it means. And global, does that mean globally everywhere? So not even when I'm online? Could it be just when I'm, randomly filling in a paper somewhere? I don't know. There's something strange. And on top of that, I wonder whether it's already difficult for website owners and operators to know exactly how they're going to interpret the signal, whether they should apply this to the first party data that they collect, or just to the third party data that they or like the third parties that get access to the data. That's something that I find really difficult to navigate if I were an American company. And similarly, which I think in VCDPA in Virginia, I think there isn't such a concept of sharing or selling personal data. Maybe it's not Virginia, maybe that's another law. But what are you supposed to do when you receive a GPC signal when you're in Virginia, if selling and sharing it doesn't even make sense? So there's a lot of confusion, and it's not like I suspect the CPPA or like some other regulators in the US should probably provide clearer guidelines as to what it means to receive a GPC signal. For now, I think it's just a really difficult situation to navigate for American companies or companies that operate in America.
Yeah, I mean, it dovetails with the challenge of people still disagreeing of when folks are really selling or sharing data for cross-context for advertising versus when someone is operating as a service provider and using that data for a business purpose. But it is incredibly messy for sure. And I think the GPC initiative has been really pushed through by technologists, and kind of they've sort of put policy and legal stuff to the side, which is fine, but those things really do work hand in hand, and they like to kind of divorce them, and then after the fact, bring policy and legal in, and it's not always the best way of working on these types of initiatives, for sure.
So we're kind of running up on time here, and I think we were alluding to this a little bit on that conversation, and maybe some just quick last final thoughts from Julie and Thomas here. But do you see a convergence on CPRA becoming more GDPR-esque, if you will?
Thomas, I think you've got a strong opinion on this. I'll let you take it, and then I'll follow up.
I see something. With CPRA, I definitely see some kind of convergence. Before, I mean, since 2016 when GDPR was first enacted, and then 2018 when it came into force. It was really the first really truly robust privacy law, and then each state or like each country in the world started like working on its own version, and then California came up with something a bit different. Really, it wasn't a copycat of GDPR, the first version, the first iteration of CCPA. But now the word, like even the concept of consent or notice at collection, the concept of notice at collection says something that resembles, or at least we get the same kind of feeling that we got in 2017, 2018 with GDPR. Like it feels like the key is really the transparency. And so more transparency is being provided to users, be it in California, be it in Virginia, in Colorado, Utah, you name it. And so I see some kind of convergence, and honestly, it's something that we should definitely wish for. That would make every single privacy lawyer's life easier. I definitely see something along those lines happening at the moment. I don't know what you think, Julia. Maybe it's still very.
I had said, so I actually think globally there's consent fatigue. I think it's a really easy, and again, it doesn't mean that there isn't a need for, interstitial banners and more easily controlled use cases. But, the European Commission actually commissioned a study. They didn't like put a stamp on it, but they publicized it, where, they're actually looking at a legitimate interest model in Europe, which is basically, an opt-out model of certain use cases, to the extent a publisher is able to really control the number of vendors that they're working with and what those vendors are doing. And I think if you kind of take that model, which I truly am going to go on record and say I think it's going to move in that direction, it requires an opt-out module. It requires transparency to the user. It requires much more tightly controlled use of that data at a purpose level. And you compare that to the US, where maybe we're going to have these global privacy signals at an operating system browser level, that are going to require, communications with users, or at least opt-outs of certain use cases that need to happen somewhat in real time, as opposed to being buried in a privacy policy. And I think we're going to end up kind of in a in-between mode. So, everyone in the marketing world who likes to say consented data, I think is kind of moving down the wrong path. And instead, you need to really think about real-time user transparency control, and truly having control over your vendors, how they're using that data. But that's going to be a ways off.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Well, we're up at the hour. Thomas, Julia, thank you so much for participating in this. And thanks to everyone else for joining. We obviously hope it was helpful to the whole group. As we wrap this up, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of the three of us directly. And if you have any more questions, or if you have any more, more information you'd like to find out about California and some of the data risks, we'll be having another webinar next week with the speakers you see on the screen here, including Tomas again. So feel free to register and participate in that. Again, thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Tomas.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Julia.
Hi, thank you.